Have you ever been judged before anyone even knew your name? Have you ever felt the world decide who you are before you could even speak? On an ordinary afternoon, a private jet sits on the tarmac, engines humming softly. Inside, silence cuts through the air like a blade. A flight attendant stands frozen, her hand still raised, across from her. A young black man sits in disbelief, the red mark of a slap burning on his cheek. He wasn't threatening anyone. He wasn't shouting. He was just reaching for his inhaler. In that moment, time stopped, not because of the slap, but because of what it revealed: fear, prejudice, power, humanity. Now imagine, if it were your son, would you stand up and fight? Or would you stay silent to protect what's left of your dignity? What would you do when the whole world is watching, but no one is really listening? This isn't just a story about a slap on a plane. It's about what happens when compassion collides with fear, and how one man's calm can expose the storm inside all of us. Because sometimes justice doesn't shout. Sometimes it breathes quietly, waiting for us to hear. So, take a deep breath and come with us into the moment when the flight froze and the truth began to fly. If this story touches you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because some stories deserve to be heard, not forgotten. The sound was so clear it could cut the air in two. A dry slap, not loud, but enough to silence the entire cabin. The middle-aged woman in the navy blue uniform stood frozen, her hands still in the air, her eyes wide open. In front of her, a young black man froze, his face stiff as if he had just been doused with cold water in the middle of winter. Everything stopped. Even the sound of the engines outside was drowned out. The cabin was filled with a heavy, suffocating silence. The man sitting in chair 3A stood up abruptly. He was tall, with a calm demeanor and a composed face, but his eyes were shaking, not from anger, but from disbelief at what he had just witnessed. He spoke softly, his voice low, each word cutting through the air. "Did you just slap my son?" The flight attendant took a step back, her lips trembling slightly. I thought he was going to attack me. He was just trying to get his inhaler from his pocket." The father's voice was steady, not high, not hurried, but the weight of it made several passengers behind him hold their breaths. A young woman sitting across the row picked up her phone. The camera shook slightly, but it was still focused on the two of them. She knew this was an unusual moment. Something had just crossed the line between personal error and social rift. The flight attendant swallowed, her eyes darting around the cabin. Faces were watching. White, black, Asian, Latino, all colors, but with the same expression: silent indignation. The young man, Micah Monroe, sat there, his hand shaking as he held the inhaler, trying to take a deep breath. His chest heaved. He didn't cry, nor did he speak. Only his look, both hurt and helpless, made the entire cabin shrink. The father, Elias Monroe, CEO of a leading American technology corporation, took a deep breath. He looked around the cabin, then looked straight at the flight attendant. His voice was lower, almost a warning, but full of control. "You just made a mistake you will never forget." A male passenger, athletic, about 40, stood up and said loudly, "I saw everything. The boy just took the inhaler. No one threatened her." Another added, "Yeah, she hit him for no reason." The murmurs spread like wind across water. A few people pulled out their phones and started recording. Elias raised his hand slightly, signaling them to stop. No need to cause any more chaos. Everything will be clear soon. The captain was called in. A grizzled, tough-looking man walked in and asked quickly, "What's going on here, Veronica?" The stewardess faltered. He stood up. "I thought he was going to attack me, so he's an asthmatic. He needs an inhaler." Elias interrupted, his voice calm. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. But there was something in his gaze that silenced the entire cabin, the authority of someone used to being in control. The captain glanced at Micah. The young man was still struggling to catch his breath, then looked around. "We're not taking off yet. I'm halting the flight. No one is moving." The internal loudspeaker rang out. "Attention passengers. Due to an incident, the flight will be temporarily delayed." A small ripple ran through the cabin. A few people sighed. A few looked at each other sheepishly, but no one said anything more. Only Elias stood still, his eyes fixed on the window. Outside, the tarmac glowed in the late afternoon light, a world still in motion, while inside, time seemed to stand still. Veronica sat down in the waiting room, her hands shaking, her eyes red. She had no idea what was waiting for her. She only knew that the slap, in a moment of vague fear, had crossed a line she would never cross in her life. Elias bent down and put a hand on his son's shoulder. "Are you okay?" Micah nodded, his breathing still ragged. "I'm fine, but they look at me like I'm the bad guy." "Dad." Elias was silent for a moment, then replied, "Son, there are eyes that have not yet learned to see the true person inside another person." The sentence was soft, but echoed in the quiet space like a string pulling straight at the listener's heart. Another flight attendant walked over and said in a low voice, "Sir, we will have a doctor check on him." Elias nodded and smiled slightly. It was a polite smile, but it was so cold that it made the other person shiver. Ava, the girl recording, paused. She looked back at the short clip she had just taken a slap, a look, a frozen moment. She sighed and said quietly, as if to herself, "This is not just a story about one flight. This is a story of an entire country." Outside, the sun had just set. Inside, the air had not yet thawed. No one knew that. Just minutes later, the video would send America into a frenzy. But, for now, all was silence and one father keeping his composure so as not to lose his temper. The loudspeaker's voice echoed again, soft and cold. "Flight Skylink 271 from Los Angeles to New York will remain on the tarmac until further notice." The plane froze. The world stopped. A slap had awakened something greater than itself. That morning, the Los Angeles sky was as clear as glass, sunlight pouring through the large glass windows of the house in Beverly Hills. The house was not ostentatious, but every detail exuded the neatness of a man who had lived more than half his life by principles. Elias Monroe sat at the dining table, a financial newspaper open, a mug of black coffee steaming beside him. He read without much concentration. His eyes occasionally glanced up toward the stairs, where music was playing softly Billie Holiday's voice. Hoarse and slow, Micah Monroe stepped out. He was wearing a loose T-shirt, backpack slung over his shoulder, and his hair was a little messy. He looked at his father and smiled. "You're reading the market news so early," Elias didn't look up. "Early warning, early bird. You should try." Micah sat down, reached for the bread, and said softly, "I read other things, like things without diagrams." Elias folded the newspaper, put it down. and looked at his son, a look that was both curious and helpless. "Fine, but remember, the world out there still runs on numbers. What about people?" Dad Micah replied, his voice soft and sharp. "People don't run on numbers." Elias started to reply, then stopped. He took a deep breath, his voice dropping. "You're flying with me today. Dress formally. The press will be at JFK. They want pictures of the Monroe Industries heiress." Micah smiled, but there was a hint of bitterness in his smile. "Heir. I know you don't want to sit in that chair because I don't fully understand its meaning, or because you don't understand what I mean." The room fell silent. Billie Holiday continued to play, singing "God Bless the Child That's Got His Own." Micah propped his elbows on the table and looked out into the garden. The sunlight hit the small bronze statue of a man reaching his arms toward the sky. "You know, sometimes I wish my last name wasn't Monroe. Then people would see me the way I really am." Elias spoke softly, but each word was firm. "They will see you however they want. Son, no matter what your name is, what you can choose is how you react." Micah fell silent, biting into his cold toast. He looked at his son, his eyes a mixture of pity and helplessness. There was something in that look that every father understands, the fear of not being able to protect his son from the wounds he himself had borne. 2 hours later, Elias's black SUV turned onto the road leading to LAX. The convoy jostled in the midday sun. The driver turned off the music, leaving only the sound of the wind. Elias opened his laptop on his lap, looking over the contract he was about to sign in New York. Micah looked through the glass, taking a few pictures with an old film camera. The lens caught a man pushing a luggage cart, sweat pouring down his forehead. He took a picture and smiled. "Have you ever thought that every face at the airport has a story?" Elias looked up and replied briefly, "I think every face has an agenda." Micah laughed. "That's the difference between an engineer and an artist." Elias looked at his son, his eyes softening. "I was both," he said softly. The word surprised Micah. He looked at his father, the stern man he thought never strayed from the norm. "I never knew what you dreamed of doing before you became CEO." Elias smiled slightly, a rare smile, as light as a memory. "When I was your age, I wanted to design bridges, but life led me to build bridges between people." Micah was silent. He looked at his father's hand, the hand with the old calluses, and for the first time he saw it tremble slightly as it held the coffee cup. The security area at LAX was crowded. The smell of perfume, coffee, and plastic seats mixed together. Elias walked ahead, Micah following. The TSA agent glanced at them, his eyes lingering on Micah. "Excuse me, I need to check your luggage again." Micah frowned slightly. "Is there a problem? It's just a routine." Elias turned back. "What's wrong? It's okay. Dad." Micah tried to smile, but his eyes couldn't hide the discomfort. The clerk rummaged in his bag and pulled out a film camera. "You have film, yes, ISO 400. It's sensitive to light, and if it goes through an X-ray machine, it will be ruined." The other man shrugged. "Rules are rules. You can leave it if you don't want it scanned." Elias stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "Can you scan him? I thought it was a passenger's right to carry film." The agent jumped slightly when he saw the name tag on the ticket, Elias Monroe. A supervisor ran over and said quickly, "Sorry, Mr. Monroe. We'll take care of it right away." Micah watched the scene silently. his smile fading. As they left the counter, he whispered, "See, Dad, if I didn't have the last name Monroe, they wouldn't apologize," Elias replied softly. "That's why you have to understand the value of the last name." Micah shook his head. "Values are shackles." "Dad," Elias turned, his voice still calm, but his eyes darkened slightly. "It can be both, but don't let it define who you are." As they sat in the waiting area, Micah pulled down his headphones and asked, "Does it ever get tiring? Always having to stay calm, always having to be correct, always having to prove that you're not angry." Elias looked at his son thoughtfully. "Yes, but anger only helps people be right when they're wrong about you." He paused. "I chose a different approach. I made them learn again." Micah looked down at his shoes, silent. The answer didn't satisfy him, but it made him think. The loudspeaker announced Skylink Flight 2701. Elias stood up and adjusted his jacket. "Come on, son. New York waits for no one." Micah put on his backpack and said softly, "You know, sometimes I wish I could take another trip, go somewhere else, just so I wouldn't be seen as your son." Elias looked at his son, his voice softening. "I understand, but wherever you go, people will still see me in you. What matters is which light you choose to reflect." Micah didn't answer. He looked out the window, where the plane was parked, the sunlight reflecting off the shiny metal like a giant mirror. In that moment, he thought, maybe his father had wanted to leave too, but never could. The two boarded the plane. Micah had no idea that in a few hours, the eyes of millions would be on him not because of the Monroe name, but because of a slap that would shock the entire country. LAX's gate area, B-17, was packed with people. The loudspeakers called flights mixed with the cries of babies and the rustle of suitcases on the shiny tile floor. The smell of coffee from a nearby Starbucks mixed with the scent of cheap perfume, creating a unique atmosphere that only airports can have: excitement and chaos, anticipation and haste. Micah slouched in his chair, headphones hanging around his neck, his eyes fixed on the large windows where the planes taxied. Elias sat next to him, his tablet open, reading the news. The screen was filled with headlines about finance, technology, and politics. They were both silent, each in his own world. "Do you think the world ever really changes?" Micah asked, his voice flat. Elias didn't look up. "Change is the only thing it does. It's not always for the better." Elias paused, folding up his tablet. "For better? Sometimes it depends on where you look." Micah looked at his father, his eyes downcast. "I'm just afraid that if I don't speak up, no one else will." Elias tilted his head, his voice low but deep. "And if I do, will they listen?" Micah didn't answer. He knew his father was right. There was a simmering conflict inside him between the desire for justice and the weariness of having to prove his worth, even as a mere passenger. A woman's voice came over the speaker: "Passengers of Skylink 271 to New York. Please, prepare to check in at Gate B-17. Micah stood up and pulled his backpack over his shoulder. Elias checked his watch and adjusted his cuffs. A line had begun to form at the door. The woman at the boarding desk, tall, blonde hair tied back, smiled at each passenger. But when it came to Monroe and her son, her smile faltered for a second. "Hello, sir. Boarding passes." Elias handed over the tickets, his voice gentle. "2 business-class tickets, Monroe." She scanned the code, looked at the screen, then at them. "Sorry, there's a problem with your ticket." She pointed at Micah. Micah raised an eyebrow. "What's the problem? It looks like the system hasn't updated. Your seat hasn't been confirmed yet." Elias leaned over, his voice still calm. "I bought the same reservation code. You can double-check." The clerk called the manager, her voice low. After a few minutes, she returned, a forced smile. "Sorry for the inconvenience. The system is down. He can come up." Micah shrugged and smiled slightly. Maybe the system has some class distinction. Elias looked at his son, frowning slightly, not blaming him, just reminding him to stay calm. As they walked through the door, a security guard stopped Micah. "Excuse me, could you open your backpack?" Micah paused. "What's wrong?" "It's just random." Elias paused, asking quietly, "Do you also check all business class passengers?" The guard looked around, confused. "We're just following the rules, sir." Micah half smiled. A rule to pick darker skin. The comment made the area quiet down. A few passengers glanced back. The attendant was silent, then reluctantly waved Micah through. Elias gently placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Don't let them decide how you feel." Micah turned to him, his voice low. "I'm not mad. I'm just tired of pretending I'm not mad." That statement silenced Elias. In that moment, he saw himself 25 years ago, a young man who had to swallow his anger and maintain a mask of calm so as not to be labeled a hot-tempered black man. They stepped into the business class cabin. The space was bright, the seats were wide, and the music was soft. A male flight attendant bowed and smiled. "Welcome back to Skylink. Mr. Monroe, would you still like espresso?" Elias nodded, thanking him. Micah sat down and looked around. He noticed the eyes of a few other passengers, not hostile, but curious, judging. A white man sitting in the front row turned around and said, "Excuse me, may I ask what do you do, sports?" I assume Micah raised an eyebrow. "No, I studied art." The man smiled. "Oh, I was just guessing. You look fit." The answer made Micah laugh briefly, whether amused or sarcastic. Elias just gently placed his hand on his son's, signaling it's okay. Micah took out his camera and held it up to the window. He wanted to capture the scene before takeoff sunlight sliding off the other plane's hull, reflecting like water. Elias looked at his son and said softly, "You always see beauty, even when others see chaos." Micah chuckled. "Maybe because you're not afraid to look closely." A moment later, Veronica Hill entered the cabin. She was the flight attendant. She was slim, her blonde hair curled, her face held a polite smile that was a habit. But when her eyes met Micah's, something tiny, a flicker of hesitation, almost instinctive, flickered. "Welcome. I hope you have a pleasant flight." Elias nodded in response. Micah smiled back, but his gaze lingered longer than usual, as if reading something behind the smile. As Veronica passed, Micah whispered, "Did you see that? See what the way she looked at me, like I shouldn't be sitting here." Elias sipped his coffee, still looking out. "Son, sometimes people don't need words to express their prejudice, and sometimes silence is a form of complicity." Elias did not respond. He let his son talk because he understood youth need to speak before they learn to listen. About 10 minutes later, the boarding announcement was complete. They heard the captain's greeting over the intercom. Elias took off his watch and placed it gently on the table. He thought of the meeting in New York, the hundreds of employees waiting for him, and the upcoming articles about the African American icon of success. But in his mind, only one image lingered his son's eyes, shining in the crowd, both proud and hurt. Micah pulled the covers up and closed his eyes. He heard the plane's wheels roll, the slight hum of the engine. His father's words echoed in his head, "I made them learn again." He wondered when the world would truly learn again. Outside the window, the sunlight was beginning to slant. Inside the cabin, the air was only just calm as water before it rises. None of them knew that in a few hours, the woman who just passed by with a polite smile would be the center of a storm, and that very fleeting glance, seemingly harmless, would be the spark that would cause an entire nation to stop and look at itself. The cabin door closed. The sound was like a soft metallic sigh. The interior of Skylink 271's business class cabin was just bright enough, the yellow light casting a soft glow on the beige leather walls. Micah buckled his seatbelt, pulled his headphones down, and stared absently out the window. The California afternoon sky was still blue, rays of sunlight streaming down the fuselage of the airline plane next to him. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to push away the unpleasant memories of security. Elias sat upright beside him, his laptop open, his spreadsheet displaying rows of numbers. He was used to turning any space into a workplace: airports, living rooms, even coffee shops. "Can you take a break?" Micah whispered. Elias looked up, smiling slightly. "You're taking a break." Micah raised an eyebrow, pointing at the screen. "I think your definition of a break is a little different than most people's." Elias chuckled. "Maybe, but you're more at peace when you work," Micah muttered. "And I'm only at peace when no one tells me to be like anyone else." The sound of the plane's wheels rolling slowly on the runway. An announcement was heard. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Welcome aboard Skylink Flight 271 non-stop to New York. Estimated flight time 5 hours and 20 minutes. Micah took off his headphones and put them on the table. Beside him, Veronica Hill walked past the row of seats. The scent of her perfume was light, sweet but a little harsh. She stopped, adjusted her scarf, and said with a polite smile, "Mr. Monroe, it's a pleasure to serve you again." Elias nodded and replied, "Thank you, Veronica." Her eyes stopped on Micah, then quickly moved away as if afraid of touching something. "Would you like something to drink?" Micah replied softly. "Water, thank you." Veronica tilted her head, smiled awkwardly. "No champagne." Micah looked at her, his smile light but cold. "No, I'm drunk enough with your gaze." Elias gently touched his son's hand, signaling, "Micah." He was silent, bent down, pretending to adjust the camera. The air between them was deathly silent. Veronica cleared her throat and continued walking. Half an hour later, the plane was cruising. The lights were dimming, the shades partially covering the windows. Elias closed his eyes for a moment, breathing evenly. He was tired, but his mind was still on the meeting in New York and the ceremony tomorrow night. Micah took out his notebook and began to sketch in pencil. The first shape was the window frame of the plane, and then a face emerged, sharp eyes, slightly lowered lashes, Veronica's face. "You're good at drawing." A male voice rang out from behind him. It was the man who had asked about his career. Micah smiled. "Thanks. Where do you go to school?" "Yale. Visual arts. Impressive. I have a daughter who goes to Stanford, but she just wants to be an influencer." "You know?" Young people these days are all about being famous. Micah shrugged. There are ways to be seen. Not everyone wants to be understood. The man laughed, thinking it was a joke, but Micah didn't laugh. Elias listened to the conversation, glancing at his son with a mixture of pride and worry. About 2 hours later, when the cabin lights were dimmed for the passengers to rest, Veronica returned with a tray of drinks. She stopped by Micah's seat and set down a glass of orange juice. "Here you go." Micah looked up. "I ordered water." "Oh, sorry. I must have remembered wrong." He started to say more, but Elias signaled him to stop. Micah shut up, took the glass, and set it aside. A moment later, as he opened his laptop to edit some photos, Veronica's arm accidentally brushed against it. The glass of orange juice spilled onto the table, splattered on the keyboard. Micah jumped up reflexively. "What are you doing?" Veronica stepped back, her voice calm. "I already said I'm sorry. You didn't. And this isn't a minor mistake. This is my laptop." Veronica looked around, trying to keep her voice even. "Can you keep your voice down? This is a public space. You spilled water on my stuff and then asked me to keep it down." Elias stood up. "Micah." He turned to Veronica and said softly, "You didn't mean it, did you?" Veronica nodded quickly, but her eyes weren't exactly apologetic, just wanting to get out of the situation. Micah looked at his father, his voice hard. "Are you telling me to let it go?" Elias replied, "You're telling me not to let someone who doesn't understand me make me forget who I am." For a moment, no one said anything more. There was only the steady hum of the engine and the faint scent of orange juice wafting through the cabin. Veronica turned away, faster than usual. Micah wiped the table with a napkin, his movements decisive, his face cold. Elias sat down, looking at his son. He recognized in those eyes the image of his younger self, helpless, angry, and trying to keep calm so as not to do something he would regret. An hour later, the cabin lights went out. The passengers were asleep, and it was quiet. Micah couldn't sleep. He opened his notebook and wrote a few short notes. Every look is like a knife. The higher you go, the colder the wind gets, and sometimes people don't slap you with their hands, but with their attitude. He closed the book and looked at his father. Elias was half asleep, his head leaning back in the chair, his face soft and tired. Micah thought to himself, maybe his father was right to choose the calm way, but if everyone was silent, who would speak up? The cabin door opened slightly, letting in dim light. Veronica stepped out, checking on the passengers. As she passed Micah, she paused, looking at her laptop, which was still on. "You should turn it off. It might drain the battery," Micah replied softly. "Thanks for the advice." She hesitated for a second, then continued walking. It was only a second, but it was enough for Micah to notice something in her eyes. Not malice, exactly, but fear mixed with defensiveness. He leaned his head back against the chair and let out a soft breath. Outside the window, the lights of the small towns below him fell like falling stars on the ground. In that light, he realized how big the world was and how small it was. Elias opened his eyes and looked at his son. "Can't sleep." Micah shook his head slightly, just thinking about what happened earlier, about how things keep repeating themselves. "You said the world changes, but I don't see it." Elias fell silent. Looking out the window, "The world changes, son. just never as fast as pain. Micah was silent for a long time. He leaned his head back against the seat, looking out at the dark sky. The plane was flying smoothly, but something was cracking in the middle of the cabin, a thin layer of ice that no one wanted to touch, but would eventually break. About 3 hours after leaving Los Angeles, the cabin light dimmed. Elias closed his laptop, took off his glasses, and rubbed his temples. Micah sat still, staring out the window. Outside, the sky was black as velvet, with small clusters of lights in the distance towns lying still beneath the plane's wings. Micah opened his sketchbook again. He drew abstract shapes, curves, shadows, a vague face, perhaps himself. Elias looked over and said softly, "I always find something in the empty space." Micah smiled slightly. "I think sometimes the empty space speaks louder than words." Elias nodded. "But sometimes it's also where you get lost the easiest." That moment was so quiet, a rare moment when father and son spoke the same language, the language of silence. A cart rolled softly down the aisle. Veronica Hill appeared, a tray of juice and coffee neatly placed. She stopped in front of their seats. "Mr. Monroe, would you like more coffee?" Elias smiled. "Thanks, I'll do. And you?" She turned to Micah, her voice more friendly than usual. "No, I'm fine." Veronica shrugged, placing the glass of orange juice on the table between them. "In case you change your mind." "Vitamin C is good for the heart," Micah replied softly. "Or do you want to test how good it is?" Veronica paused, frowning slightly. Elias glanced at her, signaling. Micah fell silent and turned back to the window. The stewardess left, leaving behind a glass of orange juice that sparkled in the dim light. A single drop slid down the side of the glass, lingering like an ellipsis. Half an hour later, Elias fell asleep. Micah turned on his laptop and pulled up some of the photos he'd taken the passengers. The light in the cabin. Veronica's face flitting across the frame. He adjusted the colors, jotted down ideas for his upcoming exhibition. The theme was distance and gaze. The wheels rolled again. Veronica turned, holding another tray of drinks. She saw Micah's laptop open. The screen lit up, showing her. She paused. "Are you taking a picture of me?" Micah looked up. "No." It was a moment. "I take pictures of everything. You're not allowed to take pictures of employees without permission. I'm documenting life, not filming a commercial. That's an invasion of privacy." "You know?" Her voice rose, causing a few nearby passengers to turn to look. Elias woke up and asked quickly, "What's wrong?" "Nothing," Micah said. "I just took a picture and she thought I was doing something bad." Veronica slammed the tray down, the liquid in her glass sloshing. "I have the right to ask you to delete the picture." Micah looked straight at her, "And I have the right to keep what I saw." The atmosphere was tense. A passenger behind him coughed. Elias interrupted, his voice low. "Micah, enough." Micah bit his lip and closed his laptop. Veronica remained standing there, breathing heavily. "You should learn to respect others," Micah replied, his voice hoarse. "I just took a picture of what happened. If you find it offensive, you're probably afraid of your own image." A drop of juice fell off the tray and onto the edge of the table. Veronica jumped, trying to regain her balance. The glass tipped, spilling onto the table and onto Micah's laptop. Orange spread quickly. The screen flickered and then went black. Micah froze, his hands shaking. "What are you doing? I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." Elias stood up, his voice low and controlled. Get a towel and wipe it up. Quick." Veronica fumbled for a towel, but her clumsy movements caused the water to spread further. Micah snatched the laptop back. His voice choked. "You know this laptop contains all my projects?" "Right. I said I'm sorry." "Okay," Veronica responded, her voice cracking with tension. Elias put his hand on his son's shoulder. "Micah, breathe. Dad." Breathe." Micah stood up, his eyes red. "Dad always tells me to calm down. But when are people going to stop treating me like I'm a threat, even when I'm just sitting still?" The whole cabin turned to look. A few people whispered. Elias whispered, "Sit down, son." Micah took a deep breath, but didn't obey. Veronica backed away, clearly not used to this kind of confrontation. "You're scaring me. Scared you pour water on my machine, and then you say you're scared of me." The captain appeared at the head of the aisle, looked around, and asked a flight attendant, "What's the matter?" The other replied softly, "Just a minor incident, sir." Elias turned to Veronica. "I demand you apologize properly to my son." Veronica stiffened. "I already said I was sorry. Not like that." He looked straight at her. His voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that commanded attention. Veronica pursed her lips and nodded slightly. "I'm sorry." Micah looked at her, his eyes moist. "I don't need an apology. I need to be treated like a normal person." Elias touched his shoulder and pulled him back down. "Come on, kid, breathe. People are watching." Micah looked around. Faces of all colors were watching them, not exactly curious, but as if they were watching a familiar scene. Veronica turned away, her hands shaking. As she stepped back, the tray of drinks hit the back of a chair, knocking a glass to the floor and shattering. The sound of shattering glass echoed loudly in the small space. Elias let out a small sigh. It seems things are getting out of control. Veronica bent down to pick up the broken pieces, her lips trembling. "I was just working," she mumbled. Elias was silent, just looking at her not with hatred, but with the kind of look that made one look at oneself. Micah closed the wet laptop and put it in his bag. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said softly. "I didn't mean to make a big deal out of a small thing." Elias looked at his son, his voice low. Sometimes it takes a small thing to reveal a big thing. Veronica stood up, her eyes red. She looked at Elias, then turned quickly, disappearing behind the cabin curtain. Micah sat back, propping his forehead on his hands. Elias looked out the window at the endless night. He knew this wave wasn't over. It was just beginning. When the cabin was quiet again, Micah said softly, "Do you ever feel like I do, that you have to ask permission to exist?" Elias looked at his son and slowly replied, "Yes. And every time you do, my dad reminds me I don't need anyone's permission to be me." Micah nodded, his eyes following the dots of light on the ground. If the world was the sky, he thought, then people were little lights, each trying to shine in the darkness, but sometimes their light blinded others. The plane continued to glide through the night, calm as a lake before a storm. In the front cabin, Veronica leaned against the wall, her eyes closed. The image replayed in her mind the glass of water, the spilled orange juice. Micah's gaze, all of it blended into a cold gust of wind. She didn't know why she was shaking. Was it because of fear, or was it because of shame? She had always thought of herself as fair and impartial, but when she looked into the boy's eyes, something inside her reflected back. something she had never dared to name prejudice. She took a deep breath. It was almost 2 hours until landing. 2 hours felt like a lifetime. The cabin lights were switched to night mode. Outside the window, the sky was pitch black, clouds drifting silently past the plane. The engine hummed steadily, as soft as a breath. Micah leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes, but his mind was restless. He could still hear the sound of juice spilling on the laptop, Veronica's voice, the passenger's eyes. It all played over and over in his head, slow, clear, making his chest feel heavy. Elias sat quietly beside him, eyes closed but not asleep. He could feel the tension in the air, an energy that didn't need anyone to say anything. Micah wheezed slightly, then reached into his pocket. He searched for his inhaler. A second passed, then 2, then 3. Nothing. He opened his jacket pocket, rummaged through his backpack. Nothing. His breathing began to get heavier. His asthma was mild, but without his inhaler it could get worse quickly. Elias opened his eyes, noticing the slight change in his son's breathing. Micah, "Are you okay, Dad? The inhaler must have fallen out." Elias jumped up, looked around his seat, lifted the blanket, looked under the chair. Nothing. He called softly, "Excuse me, stewardess." A young flight attendant approached. "Yes, Mr. Monroe. My son has asthma, and we lost his inhaler. Can you help us find it?" "Yes, I'll check in the kitchen to see if anyone has found it." Elias turned back and patted his son on the shoulder. "Take a deep breath, son. Slow down." Micah nodded, trying to comply, but his breathing was still labored. Veronica stepped out from behind the curtain. Her voice was polite but tinged with exhaustion. "What's the matter, Mr. Monroe?" "My son has asthma. We need to find his inhaler. He must have dropped it somewhere." She frowned slightly, her voice calm. "We didn't find anything like that." "Maybe you left it in your checked luggage," Elias replied quickly. "No, it's always in my son's pocket." Micah hunched over, breathing harder. Veronica looked at him, then said, "I'll look in the first aid kit for some medicine. Can he sit up straight and breathe more evenly?" The statement seemed harmless enough, but in that moment, her tone sounded like an order, cold and unsympathetic. Micah struggled to speak, his voice cracking. "I need an inhaler. No, medicine. Just calm down. The more you panic, the harder it will be to breathe. I am trying." Elias swallowed his anger. He knew Veronica meant it, but the way she said it reminded him of the hundreds of times in his life when a black man in pain had been told to calm down instead of being helped. "Can you bring the first aid kit here right now, S? I'm going to get it." Veronica turned away. Elias held his son's hand and said in a low voice, "Look at me. Breathe with me. Deep, slow breaths. Count to 4. Micah did as he was told, his eyes flashing with the fear he tried to hide. A passenger in the seat opposite an older woman stood up and pulled an inhaler from her pocket. "You can use this, if it's the same one," Elias said, thanking him. Micah took a breath, then exhaled. His eyes closed, his coughing subsided, his breathing steadied. The whole cabin seemed to breathe with them. Veronica turned around, holding the first aid kit, and saw that Micah was doing better. "Is he okay?" Elias looked at her and said simply, "Thanks to the passengers, not you." Veronica felt a pang of guilt. Her lips pursed. "I'm sorry. We did our best. Sometimes our best isn't enough, if it doesn't come from a place of genuine concern. The air between them was thick. Veronica opened her mouth to say something, but stopped. She turned away, avoiding Elias's gaze. Micah leaned his head back on the chair, his voice hoarse. "Dad, how can every little thing become a battlefield?" Elias replied softly. "Because there are wounds that the world still pretends not to see." Micah fell silent, looking out the window. Below, the lights of a city faded into the clouds. He sighed. "I'm tired, Dad. Not from the asthma, but from always having to prove I'm worth helping." Elias put his hand on his son's shoulder, his voice warm. "You don't need to prove anything. Just breathing and remembering that you exist is enough." A while later, after Micah had fallen asleep, Veronica stood alone at the back of the cabin. She looked at the small mirror on the metal wall, her face reflecting tiredness. "It's just work," she told herself. "Just another passenger." But inside, something else crept in guilt and confusion. She thought of Elias's eyes not angry, but sad. It made her realize something she had been avoiding for a moment. She had seen Micah not as someone in need, but as someone causing trouble, and the realization chilled her. A young flight attendant walked by and asked quietly, "Are you okay, Veronica?" "Yeah, just a little tired. There are a lot of special guests on this flight. I heard that man is a billionaire." Veronica nodded. "Yes, and the son." She hesitated, so nothing. She smiled faintly, but the sound of her ragged breathing echoed in her head. In the second row, Elias opened his eyes and watched his son sleep. Micah's face was calmer, but his hands were still clenched. He remembered the first time Micah had an asthma attack as a baby. He was 6, and he'd carried him in the rain in the middle of the night to the hospital. He'd thought the coughs would go away as he got older, but they'd only changed form from asthma to a choking sensation. Elias sighed and leaned his head back. Little did he know that right now, the security cameras on the plane were recording everything, every look, every word, every gesture. And in a few hours, all of it would become the center of a storm that no one could stop. The plane continued to fly, surprisingly smoothly. But inside the cabin, the air felt colder, heavier, as if the whole space was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Veronica walked slowly forward, stopping for a second in front of their row of seats. She looked at Micah sleeping, then at Elias. "Mr. Monroe, I'm so sorry." Elias opened his eyes and said softly, "I believe you didn't mean to, but sometimes, even unintentionally, you can still hurt." She nodded, then turned away. A single tear, a tiny one, fell and disappeared in the dim light. A soft loudspeaker sounded in the cabin, announcing stable altitude. "You can relax. We'll be serving a light meal in a few minutes." The room was quiet again. Micah was awake, his eyes still red from exhaustion. Elias put a hand on his shoulder and asked softly, "Are you feeling better?" "Yes, Dad. I'm sorry about earlier. It's okay. Everyone has their limits." Micah nodded, sighing. He was still feeling a mixture of shame and anger. Anger that something so small had turned into a fight, and shame that he hadn't kept his cool like his father. He turned to the window. The sky was black, the moon a thin ray of light. "I just want to be seen as a normal person," he said softly. Elias did not reply. He knew there was no way to cure that feeling. The cart clattered again. Veronica appeared with the dinner tray. Her smile was gone. Her face was tired, her eyes avoiding Micah. A light meal for you two. Elias nodded. Thank you. She set the tray down, gently pushing Micah's portion forward. Are you allergic to anything? Micah said curtly. No, I'm fine. She nodded slightly, then continued walking. A moment later, Micah opened the tray. The smell of warm food wafted out roasted chicken and vegetables. He took a few bites, trying to act casual, but the silence that stretched on felt thick. A small sound, the laptop in his bag beeped. Micah frowned. He pulled it out and turned it on. The screen flickered. Then, system error. Micah paused. All the photos, the projects, the soundtrack he'd written for his upcoming exhibition, it was all on that hard drive. He pressed a few keys. It was useless. He clenched his fists, trying to contain his emotions. Elias realized, Son, Dad, you've lost it all. We'll get it back when we get back. You don't understand. It's everything to me. He took a deep breath, his eyes wild. Before Elias could say more, Veronica returned with a tray of drinks. Would you like anything else? Micah looked up, his voice trembling slightly but controlled. You know what? My laptop is broken because of your orange juice. Veronica paused. I apologized. Sorry about not bringing my data back. You need to calm down. The word calm down rang out again, the same two words, in the same tone she'd used when she'd had an asthma attack. Micah jumped up, his chair squealing. I'm calm down. You think anyone can break someone's stuff and tell them to calm down? The cabin fell silent. Veronica stepped back, trying to keep her voice professional. If you don't sit down, I'll have to call security on the plane. Elias stood up, his voice low and firm. There's no need to be nervous. My son is just freaking out. I'll handle it. Micah turned to his father, his eyes brimming with tears. Dad, why do you always have to calm things down? They're wrong, but we have to be gentle. Elias didn't answer. He put his hand on his son's shoulder, trying to calm the wave. But at that moment, Veronica took a step forward, tray in hand. Mr. Monroe, I understand you want to help, but I need him to be quiet. He's causing trouble. I'm not causing trouble, Micah replied, his voice cracking. You're yelling in business class. I'm just telling the truth. Veronica took another half step back, then suddenly lowered her voice. Enough. Sit down. Micah looked at her. His gaze was hurt, but also fiery. Who do you think you are? Talking to me like that, 1 second, 2 seconds. No one had time to stop her. Veronica raised her hand and slapped hard. The sound rang out clearly, tearing the silence apart. The slap echoed like thunder in the small cabin. Micah froze. His eyes widened. His head tilted slightly. The passengers all stood still. Elias froze for a moment, then rushed forward, grabbing his son. Micah turned, his lips trembling, his hand touching his cheek where the red mark was clearly visible. Veronica stood there, eyes wide, shocked by her own actions. The cabin erupted, people whispered. One passenger pulled out his phone. Oh my God, she just slapped him. Another panicked. Someone called the captain. Elias turned to Veronica, his voice low and cold. What did you do? You just slapped my son. Veronica stepped back, her lip trembling. I just reacted. I was scared, afraid of a boy who was hurting because you had humiliated him. Elias clenched his fists, but his voice remained strangely calm. Do you understand what your actions will cost you?" Veronica did not reply. She looked around, as if searching for a place to hide. Micah stood still, breathing hard. He didn't cry, he just looked at her, his eyes hurt and empty. You know what his voice was hoarse. "This slap wasn't yours. It was from hundreds of people before you who thought they had the right." No one said anything. A boy in the back row started crying. The intercom came on. The captain's voice. "I hear there is a problem in the passenger compartment. Crew, please report." Elias took a deep breath and turned to his son. "Sit down. Micah, Daddy's here." Micah looked at his father, then nodded. He sat down, still looking out the window. Veronica pulled out her intercom and reported in a trembling voice, "Captain, there was a minor collision with a passenger." "Everything is fine. Are you okay?" an elderly passenger asked. "You just slapped him in mid-air. How are you okay?" Micah closed his eyes, tears welling up. Elias sat still, his hand clasped tightly around Micah's. The air in the cabin seemed to have evaporated. No one spoke, no one laughed. 10 minutes later, the loudspeaker came on again. "We were forced to return to Denver to deal with the situation. Please remain calm." The whole plane shook. Micah looked up. "Dad, they're turning around." Elias looked out the window, his voice heavy. "Yeah, and from now on, nothing will ever be the same again." Outside, the sky was still black. The plane tilted slightly, turning. Veronica stood in the cabin, her tears falling silently. Elias remained seated, his hand clutching the child's. Micah stared straight ahead, his eyes dry. At that moment, time seemed to stop. The whole flight seemed to freeze in midair. The plane banked slightly to the northeast, the city lights below fading into the distance. No one in the cabin spoke. There was only the steady hum of the engines and the heavy breathing of over 100 people who had just witnessed something unbelievable. Micah sat still, his eyes glued to the window. The sky was dark as velvet, reflecting his face tired, empty, and eerily silent. The slap was still visible on his cheek, a faint red mark spreading with the warmth of his body. Elias remained seated beside her, his hand still clutching hers. Neither of them spoke, but the silence between them was thick with words, as if a single gasp would send the air into a scream. A young flight attendant approached, her voice trembling. "Mr. Monroe, the captain wants to invite you two to the front deck to talk." Elias looked at his son. "Are you okay?" Micah nodded, but his eyes didn't leave the window. "Let's go. Dad, I don't want to be here anymore." They walked slowly down the aisle. The passengers' gazes followed them, not exactly curious, but mixed with confusion, sympathy, and even guilt. A middle-aged man held up his phone, secretly filming a video. Elias saw it and whispered, "Please, turn it off." The other man awkwardly put down his phone, but the image was not lost on the camera. Behind her, Veronica leaned against the wall, her eyes red. As Elias and Micah passed, she softly said, "I'm sorry." Elias stopped and looked at her for a moment. He didn't say anything. He just shook his head slightly, not in denial, but in helplessness. Micah glanced at her, his voice low but sharp. "Have you ever thought that just one slap could ruin a person's life?" She did not reply. As the father and son left, her tears welled up, falling silently onto the cabin floor. The small control room at the front was cramped. The captain, a man with gray hair, was waiting. He looked at Elias, his voice calm but stern. "Mr. Monroe, we are sorry for the inconvenience. According to aviation regulations, we are required to return to the nearest point of contact. Denver. Yes, ground signal sent." Micah stood still, his hands clenched. "Will she be detained when she lands?" Elias asked. "We've notified the airport police. They'll follow procedure." Micah looked up. "What about us? You can stay in the special lounge until the airline representative comes to apologize and make arrangements." "Sorry," Micah smiled faintly. "What can an apology do?" The captain was silent. Elias put a hand on his son's shoulder. "Thank you. I understand." When they turned away, Micah said softly, "You know what it feels like when you get slapped and the world goes silent?" "It's worse than the slap," Elias replied softly. "The world isn't silent, son. It's just taking a deep breath before it explodes." The cabin fell into a heavy silence. A few people began to whisper. A girl pulled out her phone and whispered, "I caught it on film. I can't believe it." A flight attendant slapped a passenger. Her friend sitting next to her whispered, "Send it to me. This will probably go viral." Elias and Micah returned to their seats. All eyes were on them. Micah bowed his head. Elias closed his eyes, trying to calm himself. The smell of metal and coffee mingled, heavy. A little boy in the back row pulled his mother's hand. "Mom, why did that girl slap that boy?" The mother looked down and said softly, "Because adults sometimes forget that they should not hurt anyone." Veronica sat in the front row of the cabin, her hands covering her face. The scene replayed over and over in her mind, her flailing hand, the harsh sound, Micah's blank gaze. She didn't know why. She just remembered that she was scared, afraid of losing control, afraid of being judged, afraid that the boy would take one more step closer, and that fear made her act, reflexively, instinctively, wrongly. "Are you okay?" A colleague's voice rang out beside her. "No, you'll be grounded when you land." "I know. Do you regret it?" Veronica didn't answer. She just looked down at her hands. They were still shaking. 2 hours later, the plane began to descend. The captain's voice rang out. "Slowly, we are approaching Denver International Airport. Please fasten your seatbelts." Micah looked out the window. Below, the city lights stretched out like a river of light. "Dad," he said softly. "How far will this go?" Elias said softly. "Very far. But the important thing is that I stand firm when it begins. Will you stand by me? Always?" He nodded slightly. A tear fell, rolling down his cheek not from pain this time, but from the knowledge that things had just gotten out of hand. There was a soft thump as the plane touched down on the runway, followed by a sigh of relief from the passengers. But no one applauded as usual. There was only silence, a silence as thick as a blanket covering the entire cabin. Elias looked at his son. Ready for what? For the storm. The cabin door opened. 3 airport security guards entered. One approached Veronica and whispered, "Miss Hill, please come with us." She stood up, looking straight ahead, not resisting. As she passed Micah, she paused for a second. "I'm really sorry." Micah didn't look at her. He just whispered, "I hope next time you learn to listen before you act." She bowed her head and walked away. The cabin door opened, and the night wind blew in, carrying with it the cold smell of the runway. Elias stood, pulling his backpack. "Let's go, son." Micah nodded, walking slowly along. Outside, the flashing green lights reflected on the wet pavement, as if the whole world were holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. At the airport, as they were led to a private waiting room, Micah looked at his phone. Message notifications kept popping up. A friend sent a link. "Bro, this is everywhere. They're talking about you." He opened it. A short, 15-second video of Veronica slapping him was all over social media. Thousands of comments were posted underneath. Unbelievable. Brazen racism. "Who is that guy? Year Justice for Micah trending now." Micah looked at the screen, his lip trembling slightly. Elias put his hand on his shoulder. "Don't read it. Don't let the world define you by your pain." Micah looked at him and said softly, "You think I want to go viral?" "No, but sometimes justice begins with a video." He closed the phone, silent. They sat, saying nothing more. Outside the window, snow began to fall, small, light flakes that melted as they hit the ground. A strange feeling rose inside Micah, cold, light, and painful. He knew that this flight would change everything, not just for him, but for the entire watching world. The plane stopped in the middle of the runway, not moving any further. From the windows, the flashing red and blue lights reflected on the night mist. Everything seemed to stand still. No sound, no movement, only the wind blowing through the metal, like the sigh of the sky itself. Micah looked out, his voice low. "Dad, why are we stopping here?" Elias replied softly. "We are not allowed to enter the gate yet. The police want to secure the scene." From the loudspeaker, the captain's voice rang out, tired but calm. "Dear customers, due to special circumstances, please remain where you are until instructed by security." A few passengers started to murmur. "Are we being held? Oh my God. I have a connecting flight," another man's voice said. "It's only right we're being held. They need to figure out what happened." Elias looked around, not angry, not afraid, just calm. He saw all eyes on him and his son, some sympathetic, some curious, and some averted. Micah bowed his head, his hands clenched. He felt the isolation, even though no one said anything. He knew the world was looking at him differently. Veronica was still sitting in the front row, watched by 2 security guards. Her eyes were red and swollen. Her hands were shaking. In her mind, the scene replayed in slow motion Micah's face, the sound of the slap, Elias's gaze. Each time it appeared, her heart clenched. A young flight attendant came over and handed her a glass of water. "Drink some water. The police are coming." Veronica nodded, her voice choking. "I don't know what I did. You're exaggerating, but they'll understand." "No, no one will." She turned to the window, looking at the green light outside the tarmac. In her life as a flight attendant, she had been on hundreds of flights, thousands of passengers, some happy, some difficult, some arrogant. But she had never felt so small as she did now. One moment, one slap, and everything fell apart. In the middle row, a group of young passengers opened their phones. This clip has over 2 million views. The hashtag Justice for Micah is topping Twitter. That girl is dead. The airline is dead. Another chimed in. I heard that guy is the son of a billionaire. Man, he's dead. Elias heard it all. He held his son's hand tightly and whispered, Don't look at it. They only see the surface. Micah nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the window, where red light cast a blood-black sky. Outside, 2 security vehicles were parked next to the plane. Airport police in high-visibility uniforms stood in line, awaiting orders. "We're waiting for the controller's orders," an officer said over the radio. "The plane is completely frozen." The word "completely frozen" sounds cold and emotionless, but it describes the situation perfectly. No one moves. No one dares speak. It's as if the entire space has been held in place by the force of a slap. In the cabin, Elias leaned toward his son and whispered, "Do you remember the first time you flew on a plane?" Micah smiled sadly. "Yes, when I was 8, I was afraid of heights. And what did Dad say? He said, 'If you're scared, just hold my hand.'" Elias smiled softly. "Well, it's the same now. Hold my hand." Micah held out his hand, their hands clasped together, silent, only the sound of their heartbeats connecting in the frozen space. An elderly passenger saw the scene and burst into tears. She took out her phone and wrote online, "I was on that flight." The father didn't get angry. He just sat there, holding his son's hand. That's real strength. The tweet was shared tens of thousands of times within minutes. After nearly 30 minutes, 2 police officers boarded the plane. The leader said clearly, "We need to work with the chief flight attendant and the passenger representative involved." Elias stood up, calmly. "I am Elias Monroe. This is my son, Micah." The police officer nodded. "We understand. Please cooperate. It is just a formality." Micah stood up, trying to keep his voice calm. "Where are we going?" "To the airport interrogation room. Just a few questions." As they passed Veronica, their eyes met for a moment. There was no anger, just a heavy silence. Micah looked at her, and for the first time, he saw fear in the woman's eyes, real, undisguised fear. He simply said, "I hope you learned something from this." Veronica nodded, tears welling in her eyes. The compartment door opened. Cold air hit their faces. They descended the metal stairs, their footsteps echoing in the still night. Beneath their feet, the wet pavement reflected the red and green lights as if the ground itself were trembling. Micah looked around. Ambulances, police, camera flashes. It was like a movie he didn't want to star in. Elias walked beside him, his voice low but firm. "Stay calm. They're going to ask some questions. I'm here." Micah nodded, biting his lip. "I just want to go home." "We will. But before we do, you need to look this straight in the eye. No running away." The father and son were led into the car. Behind them, reporters had already appeared at the fence. Flashlights were flashing continuously. A reporter's voice rang out, "Mr. Monroe, do you have any statement?" Elias did not stop, just said briefly, "Everything will be clear. I believe justice does not need to be heard by shouting." The words, low, short, and steady, were recorded and spread overnight. Millions of people shared them online, along with the hashtag Tarmac Frozen. In the airport's private lounge, as the dust settled, Micah sat staring out the window. Outside, the plane was still sitting on the tarmac, its lights blazing. The scene was like a painting, huge, cold, and sad. Elias sat next to him, holding a cup of cold coffee. "Did you know that sometimes history doesn't start with a gunshot, but with a slap?" Micah looked at him, surprised. "You think this is history. It's not about this. It's about how we react to it." Micah was silent, staring at his hands. He could still feel the heat on his cheeks, not from pain, but from the deep wound in his pride. But now, in the pain, something was moving, a small thought, a faint ray of light in the dark. He raised his head and looked at his father. "Dad, is there a chance I could say something bigger?" Elias nodded slightly, his eyes warm and bright. "Yes, but only if I say it from the heart, not from anger." Micah smiled sadly. "I think I'm starting to understand." Outside, the plane remained motionless. The beacon continued to blink slowly. The tarmac, the sky, seemed to hold its breath before dawn. The Denver night was cold as a knife. The wind blew through the glass buildings, swirling with a thin layer of snow. In the hotel room, Elias and Micah sat across from each other, silent. The TV in the corner of the room was still on, its flickering light reflecting off their faces. The news was playing non-stop. Skylink Airlines faces crisis after incident on Flight 271. Shocking video goes viral worldwide in just 4 hours. Micah bowed his head, his hands clasped together. "I never thought a slap could turn the world around like this." Elias sipped his coffee, his voice low. "It wasn't the slap that got the world's attention, son. It was the silence after it." He looked up. "What do you mean I didn't react? I didn't fight back? Millions of people saw a guy being humiliated and still keeping his dignity. It made them stop and look deeper." Micah sighed, his eyes still glued to the screen. The next news item appeared: Skylink Airlines publicly apologizes. Flight attendant Veronica Hill has been suspended, and the company is launching an internal investigation. Next to it was a photo of Micah, his profile, the light reflecting off the red streaks on his cheeks. He turned away, his voice choked. "I don't want to be a symbol. I just want to be left alone." Elias looked at his son for a long time. "I didn't choose this, but there are moments when life chooses us to say things that others don't dare to say." Micah was silent. The wind whistling outside the window was a long whisper. The next morning, Elias's phone rang nonstop. TV channels, lawyers, reporters, partners, and old acquaintances were texting. "Elias, are you going to sue the company, Mr. Monroe? You should make a statement right now. The community is calling for a boycott of Skylink." He sat in the sunlit room, calmly going through each message. Micah came out, wearing a hoodie, his hair disheveled, his face haggard. "Aren't you sleeping? No. I'm trying to decide whether to be silent or to speak up. I usually choose silence." Elias chuckled. "Yes, but sometimes silence is a message." He looked out the window, down on the street. Reporters had gathered, TV trucks lined up in front of the hotel. A group of black men held signs that read, "Justice for Micah." He paused, his voice trembling slightly. "Dad, they're there. For me." Elias walked over, stood beside his son, and looked down at him. "Not just for me. They're there for themselves, because they see themselves in me." Micah was silent for a long time. "If I say the wrong thing, will they be disappointed?" he asked softly. "You can't please everyone. You just have to be honest." At 3 o'clock, Elias received a call from his lawyer. "Skylink wants to meet with you privately. They want to settle this internally before it gets out of hand." Elias said quietly, "I will, but not to negotiate for myself." "What do you mean I want them to hear about the others, the ones who didn't have cameras when they were treated like that?" Micah sat beside him, listening. Aren't you really going to sue? Elias smiled slightly. Sue for compensation. It doesn't change anything. You want meaningful justice. Micah nodded, his eyes brightening. Maybe I should write something, just a post. Nothing long. Are you sure? Once I speak out, I won't be anonymous anymore. I never wanted to be anonymous, but this time, I want to tell the truth. That evening, Micah sat down at his new laptop. The media company had sent him as a gesture of support. He opened his profile, his hands shaking slightly on the keyboard. The first line that appeared, I don't want to be famous for one slap. I just want people to remember that every small action has a big consequence. When you slap one person, you can make a whole generation feel inferior. He paused, took a deep breath, and continued. I forgive the person who did that to me. Not because they deserve it, but because I don't want to carry that anger forever. I want to live a lighter life and hope others can learn from my mistakes. He hit post. The article went viral almost immediately. Within 10 minutes, tens of thousands of shares, major newspapers reprinted it. CNN, BBC, and the New York Times all quoted the passage, I forgive, not because they deserve it, but because I need peace. Micah turned off the screen and leaned back in his chair. Done, he said softly. Elias looked at him, his eyes filled with pride and concern. You just lit a fire, Micah. Now you have to learn how to keep it from burning you. Across town, Veronica sat alone in the agency's temporary apartment. She read Micah's article on her phone, tears streaming down her face. In her head, his voice echoed, Have you ever thought that just one slap could ruin a life? She wrote a message, then deleted it. Finally, she typed again slowly, Micah, I don't ask for forgiveness, because I don't deserve it, but I appreciate you not letting hatred define this story. I will learn to be kind again. Because of that slap, she didn't send it, just saved the draft, and then burst into tears. 3 days later, Skylink held a press conference. Elias and Micah appeared with their lawyers. Reporters packed the room. A spokesman read an apology. When Elias spoke, the room fell silent. This is not just about one flight, he said slowly, enunciating each word. This is a reflection of how we see each other. When people are afraid, they tend to react with violence rather than with understanding. But I believe we can choose differently. He paused, then looked at his son. My son got slapped, but instead of fighting back, he chose to forgive. I think that is the biggest lesson we adults need to relearn. Applause filled the room. Micah bowed his head in thanks. He didn't cry, but his eyes were wet. In that moment, Elias placed his hand on his son's shoulder, and they both looked straight into the camera light. No fear, no resentment, just quiet peace. That evening, back at the hotel, Micah opened the window. The Denver sky was clear, the snow sparkling under the lights. He said softly, as if to himself, Dad, I think I've found my voice. Elias smiled. And you know what's most important about all voices. What is it? Knowing when to speak and when to listen. They looked out. Far away on the runway, Skylink 271 sat still, its lights off. But inside them, the storm had subsided. In its place was a silence deep, healing. 3 days after the press conference, the atmosphere in America is still not calm. In every coffee shop, office, or social network. People are talking about the Skylink incident. News updates are updated hourly. America's third largest airline is in the middle of a storm of confidence. The Monroe Group, where Elias is a major shareholder, was also directly affected. When he walked into his downtown Denver office that morning, dozens of reporters were waiting. Cameras flashed and his name was shouted. "Mr. Monroe, are you planning to withdraw your investment from Skylink? Do you intend to run for any political position?" Elias smiled faintly. "I am just a businessman. I do not chase scandals. I rebuild trust." With the glass doors closed, the world outside was still noisy. But inside, the space was strangely quiet. He walked down the hallway, looking at the photos hanging on the walls, photos that documented the company's journey from a small factory in Atlanta to a global corporation. Now, each photo seemed to ask him, "What will you do next?" in the conference room. The board of directors was waiting. Daniel Cross, a lawyer and communications consultant, opened the meeting in a tense voice. "The situation is more serious than expected. Skylink shares have fallen 20% in 4 days. Some major investors are demanding a change in management, and they want you to make a public statement to restore confidence." Elias sat silent. "I don't represent Skylink. I'm the victim. But you're also the one with the most voice right now. The community trusts you. If you stay silent, they'll think you're complicit. If you say the wrong thing, they'll think you're manipulating." The atmosphere in the room was heavy. A young marketing director spoke up. "Maybe you should use this opportunity to build a new campaign about justice, about human rights. People love you. They will support any project you start." Elias looked at the young man, his voice low. "Justice is not an advertising campaign. It is a real journey, and it must start with change on the inside, not on the cover of a magazine." Daniel nodded. "I understand, but there has to be some action. Skylink has asked you to join the Aviation Ethics Reform Council, an independent advisory position. They need you to save their reputation." Elias thought for a moment. He looked out the window, where the snow was falling lightly. "If I accept, they will think I am bribed. If I refuse, they will say I am unforgiven." Daniel smiled faintly. "Mr. Monroe, in this day and age, no matter what you do, people will judge you. The question is, what do you want to leave behind?" The question silenced the room. Elias placed his hands on the table, his voice slow. "I will. But I don't do it for them. I do it for those who will come after me, so that no one will have to go through what my son did." That afternoon, Micah walked into his father's office, carrying his laptop and a cup of coffee. He found him standing by the window, the afternoon light reflecting off his calm face. "You're thinking again, Dad." "Yeah, things are going further than we thought." "How far?" "To the point where it could change the industry." Micah set down his coffee cup, his voice soft but firm. "If that's the case, I'll go with you." Elias turned, giving his son a long look. "You've had enough. I don't want you getting caught up in meetings, speeches, cameras, but you taught me, when you have the chance to say the right thing, don't hold back." The two looked at each other. In that moment, between them was no longer the distance between father and son, but two people carrying the same mission. Elias said softly, "You know, in a crisis, the scariest thing is not hate, but division." "What are you talking about?" There are people who are using our story to incite hatred. Some extremist groups are calling for boycotts of white people. Others are blaming people of color for the trouble. I don't want the conversation to become a battle line." Micah sat down, silent. After a moment, he spoke slowly. "So, we have to tell the story differently. Not about discrimination, but about people." Elias smiled. "You're starting to think like a leader." That evening, Elias appeared on national television for a live interview. The main reporter asked, "Mr. Monroe, do you think you're becoming a symbol of the new anti-racism movement?" Elias shook his head. "I'm not a symbol. I'm just a father who saw his son hurt and realized society needed better." "Do you hate the person who slapped your son?" "No. Hatred only takes you back to where it all started. Forgiveness doesn't erase mistakes, but it opens the way to change." After the broadcast, social media exploded. His quote was quoted millions of times. Forgiveness does not erase mistakes, but it opens the way for change. Micah watched the interview again, his eyes shining with pride. But at the same time, his phone rang. A friend sent him a text message. "There are extremists distorting your father's words, saying he covers for white people." Micah felt his heart sink as he read it. He opened Twitter and saw the angry comments. Some were praising, some were attacking. He turned off his phone and sat there in silence. Elias stepped in and put his hand on his son's shoulder. "You can't control how others understand. You can only control how you live." Micah nodded and said softly, "Dad, I'm just afraid that the world won't hear each other anymore." Elias sighed. "The world will hear, but it will take time." The next morning, the press announced the formal formation of the Aviation Ethics Reform Council, with Elias Monroe as independent advisor. Speaking at its launch, he said succinctly, "A culture only changes when it dares to look at itself, and that starts with each of us." The statement brought silence to the audience. Someone clapped softly. Then the whole audience stood up. On the way home, Micah walked beside his father, looking at him and smiling. "You know, Dad, I'm starting to understand why people call you the calmest person in the world." Elias laughed. "No, you're not calm. You're just learning that anger, if you wait, can turn into strength." The two of them walked down the brightly lit corridor. Outside, the wind was blowing snow, but within them, a warmth spread. The undercurrent of the crisis was still there, but now it was no longer a storm, but a silent current that was changing the direction of the entire ocean. The media storm continued to rage, but this time it was not just about justice or forgiveness. New headlines began to appear. Is Elias Monroe manipulating public opinion? The secret behind the image of America's calmest CEO, who really benefits from the Skylink crisis. These lines were like thin knives cutting through the pure image Elias tried to maintain. Micah sat on the sofa, holding his phone, reading each comment line. He saw that there were anonymous accounts posting similar posts, using the same paragraph. "Don't believe the words of billionaires. They only use stories to polish their names." Under his post, thousands of people argued, even insulted each other. He threw his phone on the table, his voice choked. "Dad, they're twisting the story. They say you're a hypocrite, that I'm paid to play the victim." Elias remained calm. He put down the document and looked at his son. "Do you remember what I told you? When you dare to speak the truth, There will always be people who want to silence you." Micah stood up and began pacing the room. "But this isn't an argument. They're making up a whole other story." Elias looked at his son, his voice soft but firm. "It's the power of darkness they don't attack with guns. They attack with words, but you can't beat them by shouting louder. You can only win with determination." That evening, Daniel Cross came to see Elias. He brought a file with him. We just found the source of the smear campaign. It wasn't spontaneous. There was a big PR firm behind it. Candescent Strategies. They specialize in crisis management for big corporations. Skylink used to be their client, but the contract was canceled after the incident. It seems they're helping someone fight back. Elias opened the file. Inside was a string of leaked emails showing a group of influential people trying to sway public opinion by making Elias look like a good guy. Daniel whispered, "If we go public, there will be a real media war." Elias mused, "No, if we go public, things will only get worse. Truth doesn't have to win with noise." Daniel nodded, his eyes tinged with worry. "But you know, silence can sometimes be taken as acceptance." Elias smiled sadly. "Let them think so. In 30 years of being a businessman, I've learned one thing: those who need to believe will find the truth. Those who want to hate will twist even God to justify their hatred." Micah stood listening from a distance. He saw that his father was still strangely calm, but there was a deeper weariness in his eyes than usual. After Daniel left, he asked, "Are you afraid?" Elias replied, "Yes, but not because of them, but because people can easily forget why they started." Micah was silent, then asked, "Do you think Veronica is also a victim of this system?" Elias looked at his son, a little surprised. "You think so?" Micah nodded. "She was wrong, but I'm starting to understand her fears. She was afraid of losing her job, afraid of being judged, afraid of facing prejudices she didn't realize she carried. If I were in her shoes, I might have been wrong too." Elias nodded slightly. "That's why you're different, Micah, because you dare to understand the people who hurt you." 3 days later, the press continued to dig deeper. A magazine published an exclusive investigation into Elias's past, deliberately distorting some details of his investment deal 10 years ago. They called him a half-baked moralist. The article spread quickly, sowing suspicion. In the afternoon, Elias attended a meeting of the Aviation Ethics Council. The conference room was lit up, with directors, advisors, and union representatives all present. The atmosphere was tense. A silver-haired man, a senior member, spoke bluntly. "Monroe, with all due respect, I think you should step aside temporarily. Your presence is divisive." Elias did not respond immediately. He put down his pen, speaking slowly. "If I step aside under pressure, what message are we sending? That justice is only valuable when it is convenient." The room was silent. The other man bowed his head and did not respond. After the meeting, Micah waited for him in the hallway. "Are you okay?" Elias smiled softly. "You see, people can fight me, but they can't make me change my beliefs." That evening, Elias received a surprise call from a woman. Her voice trembled slightly. "This is Veronica Hill." Elias paused for a few seconds, then said, "I'm listening." She took a deep breath. "I want to see you, not to defend myself, but to tell you the truth." Elias asked, "What truth? That someone approached me after the incident. They promised to help me, to keep quiet in exchange for not being prosecuted. I refused, but they still used my name for their own purposes. I'm sorry. Elias fell silent. Do you have proof? Yes. I kept some of the messages. I think they're trying to discredit you. Elias thanked her, his voice softening. Thank you for calling. You did the right thing. Veronica was quiet for a moment. You know, I haven't slept since. I thought I hated you. But it turns out I just hate my fear. Elias said softly, Fear doesn't make anyone bad. It's when we let it control us that it becomes a sin. She burst into tears. I hope one day people will talk about this not with anger, but with lessons. Elias said softly, That day will come, if you believe in it. When the call ended, Elias sat in silence. Outside the window, the city lights reflected off the tabletop, shimmering like broken pieces. He knew he was entering the deepest part of the storm, where it was no longer about right or wrong, but about people facing themselves. Micah walked in and saw his father still sitting there. You seem quieter. Elias smiled. He just talked to Veronica. She's starting to understand. Micah was surprised. She contacted you. Why? Because the darkness can regret, too. You just can't see it. That night. Elias did not sleep. He stood by the window, looking out at Denver, the lights stretching like the bright veins of a city that was never truly quiet. He knew there were people smiling behind the screens, believing they could manipulate public opinion like puppets. But he also knew that light did not need to scream to survive. It just needed to persevere. In the next room, Micah wrote another paragraph for his upcoming youth conference speech. The world isn't divided into good guys and bad guys. It's divided into people who listen and people who just want to win. He paused, thinking of his father's eyes, Veronica's eyes, his own eyes, as he stood in the middle of the plane cabin that day. And he understood the only thing that really matters is not letting the pain go. The night passed in silence. But somewhere, the first snow of the season began to fall. Soft, slow, a reminder that even storms must bow before time. That morning, the Denver sky was a thick gray, the clouds heavy as a blanket draped over the city. In the Monroe Group office, Elias sat pensively, looking out the large windows. Down on the street, people were still hurrying. No one knew that in a few hours. He would have to make a decision that would reshape the entire story that had shaken America for weeks. Micah walked in, laptop in hand. He looked at his father and said softly, Dad, Veronica just sent all the messages she had. I think we can use them to expose the people behind it. Elias didn't turn around, his voice low and steady. I know, but if we use it to attack, we'll be no different than them. Micah's voice rose slightly. But if we don't go public, they'll keep hurting people. Elias turned around, his eyes deep and calm. Go public, but not to humiliate. Do you understand? The goal isn't to make someone lose, but to wake them up. The words left Micah speechless. He remembered the first time he saw his father after the slap, strangely calm. When everyone around him was angry, he still kept that calm, the thing that made people trust him, and made those who hated him even more afraid. At exactly 10 m. Elias Monroe's surprise press conference was broadcast live across the nation. The auditorium was packed. The lights from dozens of cameras blazed across his face, cold and steely. Elias stepped up to the podium, carrying no notes. He had only a thin pad of paper and a calm gaze. Thank you for coming. I didn't come here to defend myself. I came here to tell the rest of my story. He paused, took a deep breath, The room fell silent. Last week, some articles questioned my motives, suggesting that I was using this case for personal gain. I understand that in a world where trust is scarce, people are skeptical, but I don't want to defend myself with words. I just want to show you the truth. He held up the stack of papers. Here are copies of the messages Veronica Hill, who made the mistake of flying Skylink Flight 2701, sent me. In them, she said someone was using her name to continue manipulating public opinion. I won't read them all, because I don't want to hurt anyone, but I will say this darkness always exists where we least expect it, and sometimes it disguises itself as righteousness. The room was abuzz. Elias continued, his voice low and steady, but strangely warm. I didn't name the people behind it because I didn't want to start a new witch hunt. We've had too many storms of hate. I just want one thing to look back and ask what we're doing to each other. Every share, every post, every click it can save someone or kill a part of them. He paused. The lamplight etched his features in light. I forgive not because I'm weak, but because I want to end this cycle of violence. Forgiveness is not forgetting. Forgiveness is choosing another way, the human way. Micah stood backstage, listening to every word, feeling as if someone were squeezing his heart. He could see clearly that his father was not just speaking to the world, but to the very people who had hurt him. And strangely, he felt more at peace than ever. After Elias finished, the reporters raised their hands, but he added only one more sentence before leaving the podium. The truth does not need to be shouted to be heard. It only needs people brave enough not to distort it. The press conference immediately caused a stir. The national media was divided. One half praised Elias's generosity and wisdom. The other half suspected he was trying to be a hero. But what no one expected was the reaction of the people involved. Veronica Hill appeared on an evening television show in tears, confirming that everything Elias said was true. She spoke slowly, her voice trembling but clear. He could have destroyed me, but he chose not to. That's what made me realize, maybe this is my chance to start over. Her interview went viral on social media within hours, and for the first time since the incident, the public began to fall silent. A silence not because of fear, but because they began to think. That night, Elias and Micah sat together on the hotel balcony. The city below was still bright, but the wind had calmed. Micah looked at his father and said softly, "Aren't you afraid people will misunderstand again?" Elias smiled. "They will, when they are ready. You know, the light doesn't have to win. It just has to outlast the darkness." Micah looked away, the wind blowing gently through his hair. "I think I'm starting to understand why Dad stayed silent at first. He didn't stay silent because he was weak, but because he knew that anger only prolongs the storm." Elias nodded. "That's right. Son, the hardest thing is not fighting the enemy, but not being the enemy." They sat there for a long time. Down the street, a large LED screen played back Veronica's interview. People stopped, looked up, and fell silent. Some cried, some sighed. In the crowd, everyone was probably thinking about a slap, but now it was no longer a matter of anger, but of awareness. A few days later, the National Human Rights Organization sent a letter thanking Elias for choosing a humane way to clarify the truth. He did not reply. He simply folded the letter, placed it on the table, and smiled. For him, the greatest reward was not fame, but the peace in his heart. That night, as the city fell silent. Elias sat alone by the window. He opened his phone and reread the first text message Veronica had ever sent him. "I'm sorry." He smiled, a breath of air. Then he looked out at the sky. The wind had died down, the clouds had thinned, and the first light of dawn filtered through the buildings, touching the glass, reflecting on his face. Micah woke up, walked outside, and saw his father smiling. "What are you thinking?" Elias asked slowly. "I think maybe the storm is just God's way of cleaning the air after all." He sat down next to his father, and they were silent. In the distance, a plane took off, heading toward the rising sun. Micah watched, saying softly, "Skylink 271 is finally flying again. Dad." Elias nodded, his voice soft but firm. And this time, no one got slapped. After a long, tense day, the air in Denver seemed to calm. The media storm had subsided, and for the first time in weeks, the sky was clear. Morning light streamed through the windows into the room where Elias sat, a steaming cup of coffee at his side. He looked out, where the trees lining the street swayed in the breeze. There was no more shouting, no more news cameras outside the hotel. The world seemed to have learned to breathe again. Micah walked in, holding the morning paper. On the front page was a photo of him and his father taken from the press conference, and the headline, "When Forgiveness Becomes Power." He set the paper down on the table, his eyes filled with pride. "Did you see that they're starting to understand?" Elias sipped his coffee, a small smile crossing his face. "They're not understanding me, son. They're starting to understand themselves." Micah sat down in the chair opposite. "I think people saw something they hadn't seen before, someone who chose a different path. Maybe they started to believe that gentleness isn't weakness." Elias nodded slightly. "Gentleness is the only strength no one can take away." He looked at his son, his eyes deep. "You've changed a lot since that day." Micah smiled. "I don't know what I learned, but sometimes it's harder to stay calm than to fight back." Outside, the city began to bustle. A bus stopped at the intersection. A new Skylink Air ad plastered on the side. Gone were the images of luxury flights, but a simple slogan, "We see you, we hear you, we see you, we hear you." Elias looked at the text thoughtfully. At least they got part of it. Micah nodded. "The rest, I think, time will teach." That afternoon, Veronica Hill arrived at the Monroe Group office. She was dressed casually, her hair tied back, her eyes somewhat reserved. When she entered, the receptionist hesitated, but Elias signaled for her to enter. The door opened, and the two looked at each other after weeks of turmoil. Veronica bowed and said softly, "Thank you for the opportunity to meet me." Elias stood up and smiled. "Please sit." She sat down, her hands clasped together. "I don't know where to begin. I hurt your son, and you too. But I also want to thank you, because you didn't do what anyone else would have done. Destroy me." Elias listened, his voice gentle. "I only did what I would have wished someone else would have done for my son if the situation were reversed." Veronica looked at him, tears welling in her eyes. "I got an offer to be a consultant for Skylink's new training program. They said I could help train employees on cultural awareness and behavior. I was about to say no, but then I thought, maybe I should, not to make amends, but to learn how to be a good person again." Elias smiled, that gentle smile that often made people feel forgiven. "That's a good start." Veronica. Sometimes forgiveness isn't just for the person who was hurt. but also for the one who did it. As she left, Elias watched her for a long time. He saw not a person who had made a mistake, but a person trying to step out of the darkness. And perhaps that was the best part of the truth. It made no one win, but made everyone better. That evening, Micah and Elias attended a panel discussion on justice and compassion in the media age. The auditorium was filled with students, journalists, business people, and their critics. When Elias took the stage, the lights were dimmed, leaving only a soft light on him. He spoke slowly, each word falling into the silence. We live in a time when information travels faster than thought. People judge before they understand, and sometimes hurt each other in the name of justice. But true justice doesn't need shouting, it needs compassion. He paused, then smiled. I used to think forgiveness was a gift to others, but really, it's a gift to myself. When I choose to forgive, I choose freedom from hatred. Applause broke out. In the front row, Micah looked at his father, his eyes shining with deep pride. After the talk, many people came up to shake Elias's hand. A young, white student, his eyes still wet, said softly, "Thank you, sir. I used to think such things were just politics. Now I see it's humanity." Elias put his hand on his shoulder and said softly, "If you can see the humanity in others, you've won half your life." As they left the building, a light snow was falling. The wet streets glistened under the yellow lights. Micah looked up at the sky and said softly, "I don't know if it's over, but I feel at peace." Elias replied, "There are no real endings, son. Only new chapters begin." They walked through the cold night, shoulder to shoulder, on the small street. The wind blew gently through the trees, carrying the damp scent of new snow. Somewhere, a group of people gathered around a large outdoor screen, watching an old video, the moment of the slap years ago. But this time, no one talked, no one laughed. They just watched, then quietly left. That slap had now become a memory of a lesson, no longer a wound. Elias stopped in the middle of the road, looking at the light reflecting off the snow. "You see," he said softly, as if to himself, "all darkness must eventually recede when the light appears." Micah nodded, his eyes shining. "The light comes not because I call it, but because I don't turn it off." Elias turned to his son, his smile soft. "That's right, Micah, and you are part of that light." They continued walking through the city that had just come back from the storm. Somewhere in the sky, a plane flew by, leaving a long trail of light. Elias looked up, his heart filled with a silence like a prayer. The storm had passed, but the dawn of truth had just begun. Spring has returned to Denver after a long winter. The snow has melted, and the streets are brighter in the morning sun. The wind carries the scent of fresh grass and coffee in the air. The city seems to have just woken from a stormy sleep. On the screens of high-rise buildings, the Skylink News now appears only as a look back at stories that changed the world section. No more anger, no more division, just quiet understanding. Elias Monroe sat in his new office, not the corporate headquarters, but the small office of the True North Foundation, the humanitarian foundation he and Micah founded after the crisis. The walls were painted beige, with simple picture frames hanging around, each one depicting people who had come back from mistakes and been given a second chance. Elias was looking at a proposal to support the Human Dignity in the Skies program, a civilized behavior training project in aviation, led by Veronica Hill herself. He smiled. From the fateful slap, a web of humanity had been woven, not in words, but in actions. Micah walked in, a cup of tea in his hand. He was wearing a light-colored shirt. His eyes relaxed. "Dad, Skylink just sent an invitation. They want us to attend the first relaunch of the route after the reform. I think we should go." Elias put down the paper, looking at his son with gentle eyes. "You should go. You started it, and you should be the one to see it changed." Micah smiled. "Will you come with me?" Elias shook his head slowly. "No, son, this is your journey. I've already gone through mine." The next day, the Los Angeles airport was bustling. The long runway was sunny. The ocean breeze was cool. Micah walked into the departure hall. Everything looked different, friendlier, more open, no longer the suspicious looks. A young white employee walked up, smiling sincerely. "Hello, Micah. I want to thank you, because thanks to your story, I learned how to look at others again." Micah shook hands, his eyes warm. "It's okay. I'm learning every day, too." As he boarded Skylink Flight 271, the same fateful flight number from that year, Micah paused. The cabin was the same, but the lighting seemed warmer. The passengers chatted softly. The flight attendant smiled genuinely. A middle-aged woman approached, wearing a Navy uniform, a familiar face, Veronica Hill. She stood up straight, looking at him with sincere eyes. "Hello, Micah. I'm so happy to see you again, but under different circumstances." Micah smiled. "Me too. Veronica, thank you for not giving up." Veronica pursed her lips, her voice light as the wind. "You taught me something I never understood. No one loses their value because of one mistake." As the plane taxied, Micah looked out the window. The sky was a clear blue, cloudless. As the engine roared, he closed his eyes. In that moment, he heard his father's voice echo in his mind. "The light doesn't have to win, just outlast the darkness." He opened his eyes and smiled. Beneath the plane's wings, the world opened up, no more fear or sympathy, just human to human. In Denver, Elias was watering small pots of flowers on the balcony. He didn't turn on the TV or read the newspaper. He just listened to the wind. Inside, the phone on the table vibrated. A text message from Micah Takeoff. "Dad, beautiful blue sky." Elias read it, smiled, then typed back, "I know, fly, son, the sky is yours." As he put down the phone, Daniel Cross walked in with the fund's first financial report. "True North is growing fast. Elias, big companies want a partner. You may have opened a path the industry has never thought of." Elias nodded. "Don't say me. We're just tapping into the good that's always been in people." Daniel smiled, his eyes filled with admiration. "You always say that, but I've never seen anyone believe it as much as you." Elias chuckled. "Because I've seen the opposite." That afternoon, Elias went out to the old coffee shop where he and Micah had sat after their first press conference. Across the street, a group of students were interviewing passers-by for a school project entitled, "Does Forgiveness Still Matter in the Modern World?" A young, brown-skinned girl took the microphone and asked the middle-aged woman in front of her, "What do you think about forgiveness?" The woman smiled and replied, "Forgiveness doesn't weaken you. It makes you stronger because you don't let hatred control you." Elias chuckled. The answer was exactly what he had said, now repeated in the voice of another generation. He realized perhaps the seeds he had planted had begun to sprout. The afternoon sun slanted down the street. Elias left the cafe and walked slowly through the park. Children laughed loudly. A group of young people played guitars, the music carried by the wind. By the lake, a silver-haired woman was feeding birds, her smile gentle. He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath of the wind that carried the scent of earth and water. In that moment, he saw clearly that life, no matter how many storms it went through, could still find a way to return to peace if people were willing to open their hearts. That evening, Elias sat down to rewrite a few lines for the book he was planning to publish. The Quiet Truth, a memoir that told not the story of the slap, but the journey to find light in the darkness. He wrote slowly, each word like a confession. I learned that justice is not about victory, but about the ability to see each other after the hurt. And when we stop to listen instead of reacting, we are halfway to humanity. He put down his pen and looked up at the window. Outside, it was already night, but the sky was clear and full of stars. In the quiet space, Elias said softly to himself, "The sky is blue again, thousands of miles away, on the plain." Micah looked out the round window, the sunset light reflected on his face. He thought of his father, of Veronica, of the people who had walked through the storm with him. He closed his eyes, feeling as light as the clouds outside. As the plane broke through the clouds, bright light poured in, shining directly on his face. A smile appeared, simple, peaceful. The story ends there, not with applause, not with victory, but with the silence of a clear afternoon. The sky was blue, as if the storm had never broken, but those who had lived through it would never forget sometimes. It is in the storm that people learn to see each other. The story, Flight Attendant slaps Black Billionaire's son. Seconds later, the flight freezes on the tarmac is not just about a slap on an airplane. It is a mirror that reflects the deepest things in people: prejudice, fear, and the ability to choose kindness over hatred. Elias Monroe, the calm black father, did not choose anger, did not choose revenge, but chose silence, chose understanding and forgiveness. It is that calmness that makes the whole society look back at itself. Forgiveness does not erase mistakes, but opens the way to change. The story reminds us that in every situation, we always have a choice. The choice to not let anger control us. Justice is not just judgment, but the ability to see each other after the hurt. And when we are calm enough to listen, the world will learn to understand rather than condemn. The biggest lesson of the story lies not in the pain, but in the ability to heal. Because in the end, what makes people strongest is not power, but humanity. Thank you for staying with us until the end of the story. If you feel something touching your heart, even if it is just a small moment, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to spread meaningful stories, so that humanity and understanding can continue to be told forever.